Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, a while back, or at least a while since I recorded this video, I actually did a sort of full-length video about this graphic novel here, Black Dog: The Dreams of Paul Nash by Dave McKean. Now, I've brought this book up at least a couple times since then because, well, it's a really great book, and I love Dave McKean, and I just want as much information out there about Dave McKean, and I want to plug the man's life and his career, and also, this is a good book. But I did not particularly care for my initial review of the book. And again, this is probably just my own self-esteem issues, my own sort of overly critical nature in regards to like my own work, and of course depression always factors into stuff like that. But at the same time, I'm 32. At this point, I know the difference between me being overly hard on myself and me recognizing that I can do better. And so, when it comes to Black Dog by Dave McKean, I wanted to kind of try to do basically what I had done before with Arkham Asylum and We 3, and just kind of hop back in and look at one element of the book to kind of, again, sort of show why I think this book is worth your time and why I think it's really interesting. Now, again, you'll note this book is a kind of pseudo-biography about the 20th century painter, or excuse me, 21st century painter Paul Nash. He was a World War I veteran, and during the war he had become injured, and then also after the war he dealt with the actual PTSD. Now, at the time, nobody really knew what PTSD was. Something like that really is not going to become much on anybody's awareness until you're talking about the late 21st century, when people are really beginning to realize, oh, if people experience trauma like every day for years on end, they're going to suffer from a little thing called PTSD. That's one of the reasons why this book is interesting to me, is the way Dave McKean is able to sort of analyze the trauma that Paul Nash is able to sort of experience, while at the same time also managing to sort of communicate to the reader how Paul Nash was able to take his experiences in the war and create such beautiful artwork that he made throughout the remainder of his life. Now, one interesting chapter to me, or the one that I wanted to talk about today, is chapter 11, subtitled 1917, A Swedish Hospital, London. Now, the chapter in question is relatively short. All of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages in total. So hopefully this shouldn't be a terribly long video. So I'm going to read just a little bit of the story itself, then show you the panels I'm talking about, and sort of elaborate why I think it's interesting. We see Paul in a hospital bed, and now you'll note it's Dave McKean. So usually you're looking at an artist who's not just going to be drawing all of the images within the panels themselves. You're talking about a man who has a reputation for just crafting beautiful visions through a carefully executed multimedia approach. He uses photographs, he uses Xerox copies, he uses ink drawings, he uses paintings, whether it be watercolor, oil, acrylic, what have you. Dave McKean is a true artist in the truest sense of that term. And so, as we open up with Paul Nash on the bed, I wanted to bring attention right off the bat to the fact that one of the things I also like about Dave McKean is that as much as he is an autiste, he is also an avid fan of the form of comics. And so, just about every single page of this chapter is a beautiful execution of panel layouts, both in terms of just making beautiful and startling images, but then also using these layouts in order to create and really fashion a very dreamlike environment and atmosphere that ultimately ends with Paul Nash's observations. Now, going back to the very beginning of it, I noted that the title is Swedish Hospital, London. This little passage here is supposed to communicate a kind of dream Paul Nash is having as he's recovering in an actual military hospital. He notes, a stupid misstep in the darkness, a stab of pain in my side, feeling like a broken doll, a little piece of me has come loose, a little bone island, a dislocated ninth rib, I'm falling apart. From the white walls and quiet of my dream, I can hear the noise outside, in the distance, the mad nightmare of Passchendaele, my fellows shouting in the chaos, trying to hear anything above the barrage of 4 million shells and the thunder of rain. Later, I would hear about the bodies torn and broken, sinking in the quagmire, abstraction, bits of tissue and mud and blood and ash consuming each other. Somewhere in the midst of the screams, the trivial pain in my side, the guilt, the loss, I feel a sharp scratching on my retina or at the back, behind my eye, deeper. Now, right off the bat, when we're talking about Black Dog, we don't have a kind of clear narrative. Again, this book is really more kind of a series of vignettes taken from both Paul Nash's real life experience as well as these kind of dreams that Dave McKean is creating to kind of translate trauma, not reconciliation, but recovery, and then just Paul Nash just kind of trying to process the actual events of the war itself. This opening page and this nice description is a great way of sort of transitioning slowly into the actual dream. And you'll note we get this page here, which is really good about setting up the shot. Paul Nash introduces us, kind of narrating the events of his mind, talking about just kind of hearing the war, even though he recognizes he's in a hospital. This is a kind of narrative approach that we've seen before, or at least regular readers will have seen before, or even regular viewers will have seen before if they've ever encountered anything or any kind of media that explores aspects of war. It's a common experience of PTSD that even though you are in a place that's far away from the conflict, you can still sort of perceive those sounds and qualities in the present moment. But what's beautiful to me about this sequence is the way Paul Nash literally just sort of steps into the dream. And then you'll note here these sort of sharp red vines which strew about the place. This, at least in my mind, is a really beautiful metaphor that McKean is able to craft because on the one hand, we have a kind of natural environment. These look like just a bunch of thorny brushes. But then again, at the same time, if taken from afar, they also sort of hearken or remind us of blood vessels or arteries. And again, the whole chapter is taking place effectively in a dream that Paul Nash is experiencing in a hospital. So on the one hand, we have a kind of quality of the natural world that Nash has always wanted to retreat to whenever the horror of the war hops into his mind. But then we also have this beautiful imagery which is throwing us back into the fragility of his own body. And then too, at the same time, if you'll note, we have often indications of thorny branches. It's important to note that in the conflict of World War I, the spaces between the trenches of, one side and the opposing side, there would often be an area known as no man's land. These would be large empty spaces that were usually filled with landmines. There would be spots where charges would take place, and oftentimes it was a tactic to set up barbed wire fences to slow enemy advancement. Barbed wire is something that most people are probably familiar with. It's literally just iron or steel wire that have little sharp barbs along the edges, and this is designed. It was designed originally to keep livestock in a particular area of time. There's actually a lot of books that's been written about the history of barbed wire. In relation to war, however, barbed wire was an impediment that would cost so many lives because charges would happen, people would arrive at a fence, and they would have to cut the wire, which would leave them exposed and vulnerable to machine gun fire, gas attacks, or outright fire themselves. And so, in this passage, Paul Nash is sort of being led on by this kind of song, which we eventually discover. I believe this is supposed to be a kingfisher. At least I, being, a white boy from Texas, am going to assume it as such. If the viewer happens to be able to identify different bird species, please leave a comment in the comment section below so we can talk about it. Because, one, I didn't study ornithology, and then two, I love talking about comics. Please leave a comment. But again, we have this dream in which the fragility of the body, the fragility of nature, and then the cold, hard reality of war are all kind of mixing together to create this constant impediment as Nash is being led ever onwards to what we discover is ultimately a nest. This bird has left a small nest that Nash is being drawn to in this dream, and we have this beautiful two-page spread as his hands are just reaching through this tangle of wire, blood vessels, trees to grasp what is ultimately a bird's egg. And then what does he say when he gets to it? He says, "The blue-green luminosity of this tiny egg, the shell so fine, micron-thin calcium carbonate, frangible, perfectly proportioned, the translucence just enough to allow a faint pulsing glow of pinky orange from the yolk within, blood vessel hairlines more delicate and diffuse than any Renaissance hand could have drawn. How can this delicate perfection exist in the same world as a 140-ton howitzer firing 1,000 kilogram shells that propel hot metal shrapnel into soft human tissue, into minds protected by perfectly proportioned frangible shells? Where is the insanity? In the war, in nature, and the place in my mind where these two things touch? Those last three statements are questions. Questions that Paul Nash is asking the reader as well as himself. And so, to me, what's really beautiful about this chapter is it kind of, in a really beautiful way, explores one fundamental aspect of initial trauma. Again, Paul Nash was sent to the hospital because he had a broken rib cage. At that moment, he had a really difficult wound that basically made it incapable for him to fight. Now, in real life, I don't know if that was the exact wound that Paul Nash encountered during the war. I would definitely recommend somebody please fact check that for me, and whatever answer you find, leave it in the comment section, because I legitimately want to know. But what's most important about this passage is not necessarily the detail of his wound, but the fact that he has perceived a wound in his body, he's been sent to the hospital, and in this experience, he has crafted some kind of dream to try to understand this wound. Because this wound is not just any actual wound itself. This is a wound that was created by a mass-manufactured machine that was designed to create mass devastation and destruction. And ultimately, by looking at something from the natural world, something so small and minuscule as a bird egg, but being able to observe the complexity of that bird egg, Paul Nash is able to appreciate just how bizarre and surreal and ultimately horrific this war is. Because it's not just enough that people are dying in this bloody conflict. It's the fact that such structures can exist alongside these natural structures which have developed over millions of years. So in this way, Paul Nash is attempting, through his dream, to understand what has happened to him, what has happened to humanity, and how in the hell have we gotten to this point? Again, it's a series of really beautiful decisions, and McKean plays with the form of comics, using the actual vines here almost as a kind of pseudo-panel structure before actually, if you'll observe, eventually abandoning panels altogether. Because while we begin in this nice, cleanly structured, organized hospital room, when we eventually get into the mess of these blood vessels / barbed wire / thorns, you'll note the panels begin to start breaking rules. One of them begins to sort of slip off the page, and by the time we get to this page here of Paul Nash reaching through the vines to actually hold the bird egg to try to understand what happens, we completely dissolve away into chaos. And while there seems to be some kind of way of framing the human body in some kind of panel, by the very end, in this shot especially, you can see Dave McKean is completely throwing out the panels, not to create chaos, but just to sort of convey the chaotic quality of Paul Nash in this moment. This is a dream that is not organized or pretty. This is a dream that ultimately is founded upon Nash's sense of hopelessness, his sense of powerlessness, and most importantly, his sense of vulnerability, not just for himself, but basically for all life. How can such horror exist? How can my body endure the trauma of this wound? How can anybody exist in this world? Or, as he says here, how could something like a bird egg exist in a world where, as he notes, a 140-ton howitzer firing 1,000 kilogram shells that are designed to rip and destroy and tear apart human flesh? This is one chapter in a book exploring the vulnerability of the human body in World War I and explaining it through a dream and using so many beautiful visual metaphors to explain it to the reader. I'm going to stop this video here and hopefully do another one of these in the future. I really just wanted to, again, try and show my viewer here regularly why I love Dave McKean and why I loved this book so much. There is so much to talk about in this book, and I very well may just go chapter through chapter through chapter talking about Black Dog and why I think you should read it. But for the purposes today, one of the things I really loved about Chapter 11 is the way, again, it balanced the medium, the traditional forms of the medium, and at the same time broke a lot of rules of the medium, aka a lot of the panel layouts, in order to communicate a lot of themes that McKean is trying to build throughout his whole body of work in terms of this book. So, Black Dog, The Dreams of Paul Nash. Check it out. It's amazing. Okay, I'll call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. This was a short video, actually. I don't know how I worked that one out, but nevertheless, thank you for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you like these, and hey, maybe you want to watch more. Maybe. And then also, too, please don't forget that I have a Patreon account now. It's to help me fund my visual art as well as this particular channel here. There's going to be a link to my link tree below, which will have a link to my Patreon. It's literally $1 a month. That's it. That's the only tier. There's no $1, $5, $10. It's just $1 a month because you think I'm cool and you want to help me keep making these videos and keep making art. If you just want to do a one-time thing, or if you want to give me $1 every month, I would be immensely appreciative. I don't know what I'm going to do to reward you, but I promise you I will in some form or capacity. So if you've got a couple pennies in your pocket, I would be appreciative for it. Again, last time, like I said, Black Dog is currently out of print. It is a Dark Horse comic, but like I said, it's out of print. So if you want to get a copy of this book, try your local comic book shop. They may have an old edition of it somewhere on their shelves. If they don't, try your local public library because they may have an issue of it. And if they don't, you may be able to get it through an interlibrary loan. Try those avenues first, and then if you can't go there, try eBay. But try your book shop first because they're awesome people. Try your local library because they're awesome people. And then try eBay because, you know, you got to read this book. It's amazing. And so, finally, thank you so much for your time. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.